The messages started quietly at first. A comment here, a rumor there, a name nobody recognized floating through the Facebook groups where the Whittaker conversations never really stop. Then suddenly, the name was everywhere. Justin. Another stranger claiming he could fix everything. Another outsider promising the impossible. Another voice inserting itself into a family that has already been ripped apart by too many outsiders before him. People in the comment sections say the same thing every time a new do-gooder appears. Maybe this one will help. Maybe this one is different. Maybe this one won't use them. But those comments always come from the people who aren't living it. The ones who aren't answering the phone to strangers. The ones who aren't losing sleep wondering what new chaos the next outsider will bring. For the Whittakers, it's not hypothetical. It's their lives, their stability, their last bit of peace on the line. And now the question hangs heavier than ever. Are they being exploited again? Because according to the conversations circulating online, Justin claims he's bringing a new camper, a new home, a fresh start for Larry and BJ, right there on the land they don't even legally own. He says he has big plans, permits, wiring, electrical poles, renovations, apartments, and a path back to the family members taken by the state. It sounds like salvation to people who don't know better. But to everybody who's been watching this story for years, it sounds like something else. It sounds like another scam. The troubling part isn't even the promise of a new home. The Whittakers have heard grand promises before. They've had cameras in their faces for decades. They've had filmmakers say they were there to help. They've had reporters claim they were there to tell the truth. They've had strangers claim they were there to save them. They've heard it all. But this time, the voice on the other end of the phone isn't a filmmaker or a reporter or a charity organizer. It's just a man with a phone number. A man who started calling a vulnerable family after getting their contact information from the internet. A man who recorded conversations with people who can't defend themselves. A man who says, "I love you," to Betty after knowing her for 3 weeks. And that's the part that sent alarms ringing across every platform where people talk about the Whittakers. Because Betty is not a woman who should be manipulated. She is elderly. She is intellectually disabled. She is grieving. She is traumatized. She is vulnerable in ways most people will never understand. And she is deeply lonely now that the state removed her siblings and nephew from the home. If you want to take advantage of someone, you look for people like Betty. You look for people who can't tell when someone is lying. You look for people who say okay to everything because they want to keep the peace. You look for people who desperately want their family back. And that's why Justin's sudden presence in their lives feels dangerous. He tells Betty she needs to get permits, something she has no way of understanding. He talks about wires and poles and hookups she cannot manage. He tells her he's going to get her a 3-bedroom apartment with Lorraine in one room and her in another. He says it all with authority, like he already has the power to make it happen, like he's already the decision maker in their story. But the state does not work like that. Social services does not hand over adults with severe disabilities because someone bought a camper. Custody does not change hands because a stranger says he's renovating a house. And nobody, absolutely nobody, gets an apartment for vulnerable adults without official documentation, caseworkers, and legal proceedings. So who is Justin making these promises for? Because it certainly isn't the state. And it certainly isn't Betty. And it definitely isn't the truth. Worse, he records the conversations. He gives permission for YouTubers to play those messages publicly. He turns their private confusion into entertainment for strangers. And people wonder why the state stepped in to begin with. What outsider has ever entered the Whittakers' world and made things better? Since the moment their story went viral, strangers have filmed them, lied about them, diagnosed them, analyzed them, exploited them for views, used them for sympathy, and shoved cameras in their faces for profit. They have been photographed, examined, debated and dissected, never protected, never left alone, never given peace. And now the cycle repeats again, with a man calling from a phone number he should never have had. People inside the community are asking the same question. Why is Betty answering the phone? After everything that happened, after their loved ones were taken, after the chaos of fake fundraisers, fake deaths, and exploitation, why is she still talking to strangers? The answer is heartbreaking but simple. She doesn't understand the threat. Strangers ruin their lives, but she doesn't fully grasp that. She only knows she is lonely. She only knows she wants her family back. She only knows that someone is promising to help her. And when someone promises something she wants, she says, okay. That word has become her shield against a world that keeps hurting her. But okay won't save her. And Justin won't save her. And a camper won't save her. That's what makes this situation more horrifying than strange. It is predictable. Vulnerable people are always the easiest targets. And when vulnerable people are also poor, disabled, elderly, and isolated, exploitation becomes a revolving door. First, it was curiosity seekers driving down the dirt road to stare at the family like a roadside attraction. Then it was YouTubers filming them for shock value. Then it was scam fundraisers. Then it was people faking family deaths online for money. Now it's strangers calling with promises of homes they can't provide. Every new outsider brings new harm, while the family remains stuck in the same cycle. Hopeful for a moment, disappointed for a lifetime. And this is exactly how exploitation works. You don't need money to scam someone. You don't need a business. You don't need a charity page. All you need is a voice, a promise, and a victim willing to believe you. And the Whittakers have been forced into belief for decades because belief feels better than abandonment. But at what point does the world acknowledge the pattern? At what point do people stop pretending that kindness is what drives these outsiders? At what point does someone say enough? Because every time a stranger steps into their world, someone gets hurt. Sometimes it's them. Sometimes it's the viewers. Sometimes it's both. And this new situation, this Justin situation, is beginning to look like the same cycle all over again. Recording vulnerable adults. Promising things he cannot deliver, acting like he has authority, inserting himself between the family and the state, telling them he loves them after 3 weeks. These are red flags in any situation. In the Whittaker situation, they are blaring sirens. And the most important question is the one almost no one is asking. Why does he want access to them? Nobody does this kind of work for free. Nobody buys campers for strangers without motive. Nobody appears out of nowhere offering salvation unless they want something in return. And when a family cannot protect themselves, the rest of us have to ask the question they can't. Is this a rescue or is this a scam? Comment below what you think. The deeper people looked into Justin's sudden involvement with the Whittakers, the more unsettling the situation began to feel. It wasn't just the promises. It wasn't just the recordings. It wasn't just the strange familiarity he used with Betty. It was the pattern, a pattern the Whittakers have lived through far too many times. Promises made by strangers always follow the same script. Step 1, I want to help. Step 2, I know what's best for you. Step 3, trust me. Step 4, devastation. The community has watched this cycle repeat enough times to recognize it instantly. Yet the family at the center of it all still doesn't see the danger. Not because they are naive, but because nobody has ever protected them in a way that teaches them how to recognize red flags. People online began asking the uncomfortable questions others were afraid to voice. What does Justin want from them? Why record conversations with vulnerable adults? Why push for permits and wiring in apartments when he hasn't even proven he has the authority or resources to make those decisions? Why talk about moving a camper onto land that the family reportedly does not own? Why insert himself into the middle of a tense and complex situation with state authorities? And most importantly, why is he promising outcomes he cannot possibly guarantee? Those promises are the first sign something is off. Anyone familiar with social work, adult services, guardianship, or disability advocacy knows that nothing in this world moves fast. Nobody gets apartments overnight. Nobody gets custody by phone call. Nobody bypasses court orders with enthusiasm. And nobody solves a multi-decade poverty crisis with a camper. But to Betty, the word promise means hope. And hope is the one thing she never stopped clinging to. People began replaying Justin's recorded conversations online and listening more closely. They heard the same pattern in every sentence, a tone of authority mixed with emotional manipulation. He didn't ask Betty what she wanted. He didn't ask what she understood. He didn't ask what she was capable of doing. He spoke as though he was already in charge, as though his decisions carried weight, as though her only job was to comply. Betty's responses told their own story. Her gentle, okay, repeated over and over, wasn't agreement. It wasn't comprehension. It wasn't consent. It was a coping mechanism. It was a way to survive conversations that moved too fast, too complicated, too overwhelming for her to keep up with. Many people with intellectual disabilities learn to mirror agreement because it prevents conflict. The word becomes a shield, a survival tool. But people looking from the outside, especially those who do not understand disability, hear that okay and assume it means she understands a plan. They assume she is informed. They assume she is consenting. In reality, Betty may not understand what a permit is, what electrical work involves, what property ownership requires, or what apartment leases look like. She may not fully understand what the state needs from her, what the law allows, or what the timeline for reunification involves. Which is why any stranger stepping into her world with big promises instantly triggers alarm for anyone who has worked in the field. The next major concern was how quickly Justin inserted himself into conversations about state custody. He referenced getting Betty an apartment so she could get her siblings back, as if that were a simple transaction. People familiar with the system immediately pointed out how dangerous that assumption is. Reunification does not depend on living space alone. It requires evaluations, supervision, approvals, plans, and oversight. It requires trained professionals. A stranger cannot simply declare himself the architect of that process, and a vulnerable adult cannot give informed consent to a plan she does not understand. At this point, longtime watchers of the Whittaker story began comparing this situation to previous ones. The family has had individuals show up claiming they could fix things, claiming they could take control of the property, claiming they could manage finances, claiming they could rebuild their lives. Some meant well. Some are confused. Some are opportunistic. Some are dangerous. This is what happens when a family becomes famous without protection. They attract helpers, heroes, saviors, opportunists, and manipulators alike. And the risk is never small. Justin also told Betty that he loved her, despite only speaking with her for a few weeks. That moment, more than anything, set off alarm bells. To many, it felt inappropriate. To others, it felt manipulative. To the most cautious among the community, it felt like grooming, not necessarily in a criminal sense, but in the sense of establishing emotional dominance over someone who cannot question his intentions. Betty replied, "I love you too, but people who know how she communicates understand exactly what that meant. It wasn't intimacy. It wasn't trust. It was conditioning. She responds with love when someone gives her attention or affection because she has lived most of her life receiving neither. When someone shows up with a large plan but no transparency, it is reasonable to worry. And when someone communicates with vulnerable adults who cannot evaluate the truth of those promises, the worry becomes urgent. Even more concerning was how accessible the family's phone number remains. It has been shared publicly far too often. Strangers call regularly, some curious, some kind, some cruel, some predatory. It is extremely easy for someone to build rapport with vulnerable adults who are isolated, lonely, and confused. Justin is not the first to take advantage of that access. And unless someone intervenes, he will not be the last. Then came the conversation about Gloria, another stranger circling the situation. Nobody knows yet whether her intentions are good, misguided, or opportunistic, but the pattern is already familiar. People hear the name and brace themselves, because the Whittakers do not need more hands reaching into their lives. They need fewer. Support should come from professionals, not people who appear online one day and insert themselves into the middle of a delicate legal situation the next. Strangers always seem to enter the Whittaker story with the same belief. We know better than you. We can fix this. We're going to save you. But the Whittakers have survived almost a century in those hills. They have endured winters without heat, summers without air conditioning, storms without shelter, decades of hardship without asking strangers for rescue. What destroyed their peace was not poverty. It was exposure. It was the cameras, the tourists, the trespassers, the speculators, the online rumors, the assumptions, and the meddling. Their lives were stable in their own way for decades. Then the world showed up. Now, instead of strangers leaving them alone, they have strangers offering them new homes, new plans, new futures, plans that always end with disappointment or worse. Justin's involvement looks like the continuation of that cycle. A cycle of outsiders promising something the family wants so desperately that they can't see the danger in believing it. The community watching from the outside sees the red flags. Betty and Larry do not. Without an advocate, they cannot separate promise from possibility or help from harm. By the end of part 2, one question becomes unavoidable. When does help become exploitation? And how many more strangers will step into their lives before someone stops this pattern? Comment below what you think. The more people looked at the pattern surrounding the Whittakers, the more they realized that the real issue wasn't Justin himself. The problem was the environment that made someone like him feel entitled to step into their lives in the first place. The Whittakers have become a magnet for outsiders, not because the family is doing anything to attract them, but because their vulnerability creates an opening that outsiders cannot resist exploiting. People always justify it the same way. I'm just trying to help. I'm doing what nobody else will do. They need someone like me. But the truth behind those statements is rarely pure. Sometimes the desire to help is just disguised curiosity. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's savior syndrome. Sometimes it's a need for attention, validation, or online clout. And sometimes, tragically, it is deception dressed up as compassion. The Whittakers live at the intersection of poverty, disability, isolation, and fame, a combination so volatile that almost anyone can claim they know what's best for them and receive immediate validation from people who have never met the family. It creates a perfect storm where the loudest outsider becomes the hero in their own story, even if the family becomes collateral damage. That's the danger Justin represents. Not because people know he is harmful, but because they know the landscape he is walking into. A landscape filled with exploitation dressed as charity. A landscape where promises turn into leverage. A landscape where one vulnerable okay from Betty becomes the foundation for someone else's fantasy of being the family's rescuer. People began to ask the question Justin never addressed directly. How does he benefit from all of this? It's not enough to say he's kind. True kindness happens quietly. It doesn't require recorded conversations. It doesn't require sharing private audio on YouTube channels. It doesn't require strangers hearing Betty's confusion and heartbreak for entertainment. It doesn't require someone inserting themselves into complex state matters they do not understand. Kindness is never loud, but exploitation always is. Even if Justin believes his intentions are good, his actions don't match the reality of the situation. He speaks with authority he does not have, promises outcomes he cannot guarantee, and gives emotional intimacy that confuses a vulnerable adult into believing he is trustworthy. These patterns are subtle but powerful, the kind of behaviors that social workers are trained to recognize immediately, but that the general public often misses. And when the general public does start to notice something feels wrong, it's already too late for the family at the center of it. Comment sections exploded with people pointing out the same frightening truth. Betty doesn't understand who means well and who doesn't. She doesn't have the capacity to evaluate the intentions of strangers. She doesn't recognize manipulation because most of her life has been shaped by people telling her what to do, how to feel, and what to believe. She is not equipped to challenge someone who uses emotional language, authoritative tone, and promises of reuniting her family. In fact, the more she wants to believe someone, the more vulnerable she becomes. Justin telling her, "I love you," was not just a red flag. It was a neon sign. Vulnerable adults often respond to affection with compliance. They bond quickly, trust blindly, and attach deeply to anyone who shows consistent attention. And once emotional attachment forms, it becomes nearly impossible for them to push back, even when the situation becomes unsafe. That's how exploitation happens without violence. It happens through trust. It happens through promises. It happens through emotional. People who want to help do not broadcast their interactions. They do not turn confused dialogue into online content. They do not expose private communication from vulnerable adults to the public. They do not treat Betty's trust as entertainment. When the Whittakers' phone number leaked online, it opened the floodgates for exactly this type of intrusion. Strangers could call them at any time. Strangers could visit their home. Strangers could promise them things. Strangers could lie, deceive, manipulate, or influence them with nothing stopping it. The only protection they had was their own ability to discern danger, and that ability has been compromised by trauma, disability, and loss. People drew parallels to earlier events that had harmed the family. Fundraisers that spiraled out of control. False claims about deaths. Miscommunications that went viral. Online rumors that damaged trust with the community. Outsiders who meant well but caused unintended harm. Outsiders who didn't mean well at all and caused far worse. Now, the cycle repeats itself with alarming familiarity. The question that keeps resurfacing is, where are the safeguards? Why isn't there someone in the family's corner who can filter these interactions? Why is Betty answering the phone at all? Why are strangers allowed to communicate with her unsupervised? Why is Larry, who struggles with comprehension and processing information, being tasked with finding permits, electricians, and plumbers because a stranger said so? It isn't just unethical, it's dangerous. People forget that sudden change, especially when initiated by outsiders, destabilizes vulnerable adults. It creates confusion. It creates fear. It creates unrealistic expectations. And when those expectations collapse, which they usually do, the emotional fallout can be devastating. This is how exploitation often happens. Not through force, through hope. Hope that someone will save them. Hope that someone will bring their family back. Hope that someone will give them the home, comfort, and stability they've never had. And people like Justin, intentionally or unintentionally, use that hope as a tool. He may believe he is trying to help, but intention does not erase impact. This is why those watching the situation unfold are becoming increasingly alarmed. They've seen the Whittakers cry. They've seen them confused. They've seen them embarrassed, overwhelmed, and hurt by the world's fascination with them. And now they're watching a new stranger offer them dreams he cannot deliver. More than anything, this moment reveals something heartbreaking. The Whittakers don't have boundaries because they've never had the chance to build them. When you grow up isolated, with no stable support network, no education, no access to advocacy, and no tools to recognize manipulation, you become vulnerable in ways that outsiders immediately notice. And the wrong outsiders take advantage of that. Part 3 reveals the core truth behind this growing concern. The problem isn't one man named Justin. The problem is that the world keeps seeing the Whittakers as a story instead of family. Every new character entering their lives feels like a plot twist, not a risk. Every new promise feels like a storyline, not a potential threat. Every new outsider is judged by their intentions, not the effect they may have on fragile lives. The Whittakers have survived decades of hardship. What they may not survive is the endless parade of people trying to save them. Comment below what you think. What scares people most about the situation unfolding around the Whittakers isn't the shock factor anymore. It isn't the viral attention, the internet theories, or even the state intervention. What scares them is the realization that this family has become trapped in a cycle that repeats itself like clockwork. Exposure, intrusion, promises, disappointment, and harm. And every time a stranger steps in, that cycle begins again. Justin became the newest link in a chain the Whittakers never asked for. It's not just about one man. It's about what his arrival represents. The ongoing vulnerability of a family that has been stripped of privacy, stripped of autonomy, and stripped of the ability to protect themselves from those who claim they're only trying to help. People online started connecting the dots. The more they looked at how these patterns kept resurfacing, the more they realized the Whittakers don't just need compassion. They need protection. Real protection. Protection from outsiders. Protection from false promises. Protection from the emotional manipulation that follows every new savior who enters their lives. Because the Whittakers are not characters in a documentary. They're not a charity project for strangers to experiment with. They are not a storyline to be rewritten by people craving meaning or attention. They are a family caught in the crossfire of public fascination. Over the past few years, their name has become currency on social media. For some creators, mentioning the Whittakers is enough to bring views. Some use their story to push their own agendas. Some twist facts to fit narratives. And some insert themselves physically into the family's life, hoping to turn their involvement into something bigger. This is what exploitation looks like in the digital age. It doesn't always take money. It doesn't always take malice. Sometimes it only takes attention. And for a family as isolated and vulnerable as the Whittakers, attention becomes a weapon. Justin's situation exposed this reality in a new way. His conversations with Betty revealed just how easy it is for a stranger to influence them. Not because they're weak, but because they've never been given the tools to defend themselves. They've never been taught how to set boundaries. They've never been taught how to identify manipulation. They've never been taught how to navigate systems. They've never had consistent, trusted advocates. So when someone calls with promises, they believe. Because belief is all they have. And that belief has cost them more than the world will ever know. The tragic part is that strangers don't just manipulate the Whittakers emotionally. They interfere with their legal situation. Promising an apartment, promising a camper, promising a path to reunification can create false expectations that clash with state requirements. When people who truly understand the system know that the worst thing a stranger can do is insert themselves between a vulnerable adult and the state, it complicates everything. It slows everything down. It creates confusion for social workers who are already dealing with lack of resources, heavy caseloads, and complex needs. Justin's interference, even if he thinks he is helping, risks making the situation worse for Betty, Larry, and the family members taken into care. Worse yet, it risks triggering suspicion from the state. Are the Whittakers being manipulated? Are strangers influencing their decisions? Are people making promises that compromise the reunification process? When the state sees instability around a vulnerable family, it reacts cautiously, sometimes severely. That is why interference is so dangerous. It feeds a system that already fears the risks involved with reunifying disabled adults into an unsafe or unpredictable environment. Every stranger who enters the Whittaker world, deliberately or accidentally, adds another layer of instability. And that instability leads to one of the darkest truths about their situation. The biggest threat to the Whittakers right now isn't their poverty. It isn't their disability. It isn't their living conditions. It's the intrusion of unqualified outsiders. This realization became painfully clear when people began discussing what kind of help the Whittakers actually need. The answer wasn't a camper. It wasn't an apartment. It wasn't a YouTuber. It wasn't a Facebook activist. It wasn't someone calling to say, "I love you," after 3 weeks. What they need is a licensed advocate, someone trained to navigate disability rights, someone who understands the state's requirements, someone who knows how to speak the language of social services, someone who can push back on bureaucratic delays and demand transparency. But advocates like that are rarely the ones who show up uninvited. Instead, people like Justin walk through the door, promising what they cannot give. This is why many viewers and locals feel frustrated, even angry. They see the same mistakes repeating themselves. They see the same heartbreak forming in slow motion. They see the same cycle waiting to swallow the family all over again. They see a family that wants nothing more than to live in peace. Yet peace is the one thing strangers keep taking from them. And this leads to the final, uncomfortable truth. The Whittakers don't need to be saved. They need to be left alone long enough to be supported by legitimate professionals. They need stability, not spectacle. They need boundaries, not promises. They need advocates, not rescuers. They need protection, not pity. Because every time a stranger walks into their lives with a plan, the family ends up paying a price. Sometimes that price is emotional. Sometimes it is financial. Sometimes it is relational. Sometimes it is the loss of trust in the very people who are supposed to help them. The world has mistaken involvement for compassion. Real compassion knows when to step back. Real compassion respects boundaries. Real compassion understands the danger of false hope. The Whittakers deserve more than a revolving door of outsiders with dreams of being heroes. They deserve stability. They deserve clarity. They deserve protection. And most importantly, they deserve the chance to make decisions without manipulators disguising themselves as saviors. The question now is simple. Will people finally learn? Or will the cycle begin again with the next stranger who decides he knows what's best? Comment below what you think. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.